Hey guys, my name is Tommy Dimsdale. I'm a regional director with the National Association for Gun Rights, and we want to welcome you to another History Hour production. Last week we focused on the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, where a returning group of GIs from World War II came back home to their communities to find out that they were completely riddled with a bunch of bad cops and corrupt politicians, of which they forcibly removed from their community. It's an absolutely riveting tale, and if you want more information on that or you want to watch that video, click on the link above. But as for today, this week, we are going to focus on the Battle of Kings Mountain. On October 7th of 1780, the battle took place here. Right behind me in these hills is where a group of wily, individualist, rugged frontiersmen, also known as the Over Mountain Men, came here to provide an assault on Major Patrick Ferguson's forces at the top of the hill. And it was an amazing, amazing battle. It's a really cool story. Not only were these men coming here to, seek justice for the hundreds of their fellow countrymen who had been brutally slaughtered at the hands of Banastre Tarleton, but they were also taking part in a pivotal role in the Revolutionary War that would turn the tides for the battle for independence in America. This is the story of Kings Mountain. 1780 was the 5th year of the Revolutionary War, and at this point, Washington's resolve and his men both were growing weary. Considering enlistments only lasted about a year, it brought a lot of uncertainty to the men as they would routinely go back to their families and farms, and Washington knew that something consequential must transpire in order to break the stagnation of this slow and burdensome conflict. As more British troops arrived to the New World, things became increasingly tiresome for the Patriot forces, and most people were apathetic enough to the cause that they often sided as loyalists to the Crown, especially in South Carolina. The Continental Army was due for a break in their misfortune, but it just never seemed to arrive. On May 12, 1780, Charleston, South Carolina fell rather easily into British hands, another blow to the already tested morale of the Patriot cause. Nonetheless, Colonel Abraham Buford of the Continental Army rides south with his men thinking he is going to assist his fellow freedom fighters in Charleston. But by the time Buford receives news that Charleston has already fallen, he's already within the grasp of a particularly cruel and aggressive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton was already known for his hatred towards the rebel cause. If they would not bow down to the British Crown, well, he had very little use for their lives. Tarleton would demonstrate this very sentiment as he caught Buford and his men just across the North Carolina border in a small community known as the Waxhaws. Upon meeting them in the battlefield, Tarleton gave orders for Buford and his men to lay down their arms and surrender. As could be expected, Buford refused, and before the Continentals could even think about assembling their lines for battle, Tarleton ordered an attack, quickly passing through the Patriot lines like a hot knife through butter. Tarleton's men cut the Continental lines into ribbons. Before long, it's made painfully clear that the only method of survival for Buford and the rest of his men, unfortunately, is to surrender. Buford and his men affix white claws to the end of their bayonets as Tarleton's men circle around for another devastating pass. But, once again, Tarleton has little use for those who oppose the Crown in any fashion. His men ride through the lines of surrendering Patriots, swords ringing as they cut the men to pieces. Surrendering Patriots are running for their lives as Tarleton's men circle back repeatedly, striking down every foe until none is left standing. The devastation was nothing less than horrific. One Continental medic spoke of the situation afterwards. He said the demand for quarter, seldom refused of a vanquished foe, was at once found to be in vain. Not a man was spared for 15 minutes. After every man was prostrated, they went over the ground, plunging their bayonets into those who exhibited any signs of life. And in some instances, where some had fallen one over the other, these monsters were seen to throw off on the point of a bayonet the uppermost to come at those underneath. The massacre that became known as Tarleton's Quarter saw 113 Virginians killed and another 150 wounded to the point of not being able to fight back when Tarleton's men made their rounds again with their bayonets, snuffing out life wherever it lingered. At this point, British confidence over the Southern campaign swelled, and the British commander Sir Henry Clinton remarked on the situation. He said, "There are few men in South Carolina who are neither our prisoners or in arms with us." What Clinton and other British commanders did not take into account was the small pockets of men in the upstate and the Blue Ridge areas that saw and would long remember Tarleton's Quarter at Waxhaws. And while the war went on, these bands of Scotch-Irish fighters would not soon forget their fallen brethren, and when provoked to a fight, would not stop until that debt of violence had been paid outright. By June of 1780, most of South Carolina's Southern families had aligned themselves firmly in the Loyalist camp, whether that be intimidation or their true feelings, likely intimidation. British sentiment was at an all-time high, but in a quote commonly referenced from Samuel Adams, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority keen on setting brushfires of freedom in the minds of men." As the war persists into August, British Commander Clinton steps down to allow Lord Cornwallis to take control of the Southern campaign in the colonies. Clinton instructs Cornwallis to start assembling a Loyalist militia from the community and building good faith among the population and reassuring locals that the crown is indeed here to stay. Cornwallis detests the strategy and does not trust the locals to adhere to strict guidelines of the British military. He doesn't like it. However, a pivotal character in this story is about to make his appearance, because before Clinton leaves, he takes that matter out of the hands of Cornwallis by appointing Major Patrick Ferguson as the Inspector of Militias in the Southern Province. Ferguson has a fair amount of weight to throw around among his fellow officers, as his invention of the Ferguson rifle helped earn him the title of the most accurate rifleman in the King's Army. At the time, the Crown almost exclusively used smoothbore muskets, which were painfully inaccurate and took far too long to load from the muzzle. Ferguson's design was revolutionary, pardon the pun there, as it could be more easily loaded from the breech. Instead of 2 or 3 rounds per minute, the standard musket was able to produce, with the right hands, the Ferguson rifle could fire 6 to 10 shots per minute, a vast improvement. And Ferguson's unconventional guerrilla-style tactics in battle was often sneered at by his superiors, but soon earned him one of the lowest killed and wounded counts of any unit in the British Army. But Ferguson's prior successes did not keep him from clashing with both Cornwallis and Tarleton, namely over their brutality to the American townspeople. You see, Ferguson's natural inclination is not to wield with an iron fist, but more so a velvet glove. And this serves him well in his role in recruiting the local population to fight on behalf of the king. While Cornwallis and Tarleton exercise cruel methods of power to assert authority, Patrick Ferguson spends ample time in the communities getting to know the people, while both Cornwallis and Tarleton are waiting on the first available opportunity to go back to Britain. Ferguson is wishing to stay and work alongside the recruits once the war has been won. In this way, Ferguson's tactics are completely lost to his superiors, and they often find themselves in multiple confrontations with each other on a regular basis, with Ferguson going so far as to arrest a few of Tarleton's men for crimes against the colonists. So yeah, needless to say, at this point, these men despise each other deeply. Ferguson had been in military service since the early age of 14, and now, at the age of 35, he found himself towing the line of holding his superiors away from the colonist population and recruiting loyalists to his ranks. The young major had been tasked with erecting a loyalist militia of 4,000 men, with 1,000 of those being active and at the ready at any opportune moment. His diplomatic but aggressive style led to the admiration from his men and the nickname the Bulldog. Ferguson's tactics, balanced style, and demeanor cast him perfectly for his new role.
Patrick Ferguson is he's an interesting character, very, very accomplished guy. Operates on a much higher plane than I think a lot of other leaders are. Is he an arrogant jerk? Yeah, all of them are, but that's the standard of the day. Officers today are arrogant, but officers in the 18th century, they vie with each other for accolades and for the respect of their peers and their superiors, and maybe for a promotion here and there too. But Patrick Ferguson is an impressive guy, and he does train men. He's believed to be, according to Clinton anyway, a more charismatic guy that can help sway you over to the side of the king. If you've been a bad boy in the past, straddling the fence, maybe you can come over to the side of right, to the king's side.
In July, the Continental Congress, disappointed with Washington's efforts in the North, quietly reassigned leadership of the Southern campaign to General Horatio Gates. On July 25, 1780, General Gates takes command of 1,400 Continental regulars and begins his march south from North Carolina to put a halt to Cornwallis's advance towards Charlotte. As he makes his way south, he encounters several patriot forces and militias that join his cause and bolster his numbers to nearly 3,000 men, which is a good number, but despite Gates' numbers, he would soon find a nasty defense set up by Cornwallis at the Battle of Camden on August the 16th, 1780. After Gates retreats from the battle, the men who lagged behind were in complete disarray. The Patriot forces suffered a terrible blow that day with not only 800 casualties, but another 1,000 soldiers captured. It was a mess. One rebel officer spoke of the days after the defeat. He said, "A few days after General Gates's defeat, Lord Cornwallis let loose the dogs of war on the poor inhabitants, and Tarleton with his bloodhounds excelled in brutality. Unfortunate men who were found peaceably and quietly at their homes were cut to pieces, and every species of cruelty was exercised throughout the country." Gates's assault was not completely in vain, however. Cornwallis suffered a decent loss and of more than about 20% of his men, and many more were suffering from fever. This basically forced Cornwallis to rely more on Fergus's militia to the west, and Cornwallis at this point has no choice but to stand by while his army regains their strength, which is pretty hard for Cornwallis since the path to North Carolina is now fairly open. He just can't move as easily. In the days and weeks to come, South Carolina would become a hotbed of violence and infighting among friends and families, some patriots and some loyalists. Up to this point, the Scotch-Irish, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, had pretty much stayed out of the war, but amidst Tarleton's quarter in Waxhaws and the fate of the prisoners from Horatio Gates's forces most recently, and the steady depopulation of their homeland during the infighting, the rugged men of the mountains were about to prove their worth and efficiency for violence on the battlefield. You see, the British had just pushed too hard and for too long, and in that grave error, they had awoken a sleeping giant in the woods of the South Carolina upstate. Subsequently, these men became a lasting pain in the side of General Cornwallis, as he likened their presence as sitting naked atop a hornet's nest. One of Ferguson's officers described them. He said, "These distinguished race of men are more savage than the Indians and possess every one of their vices and not one of their virtues." British scouts took notice and wrote to both Cornwallis and Tarleton of the militia amassing in the foothills and urged a force to come down and stamp out the movement before it became too strong. But with both Cornwallis and Tarleton conveniently being ill with fever, these reports never received a reply. The Overmountain men kept growing. On August 9th, Patriot forces joined together to attack the British at Musgrove's Mill, not far south from Cowpens. Patriots take a sweeping victory, leaving 63 Loyalists dead and 90 wounded. Patriot losses were meager, with only 4 dead and 8 wounded, and when news of this defeat travels back to Ferguson, the Major loses his affinity for his diplomatic tendencies. He issues a proclamation to all the surrounding communities that he plans to rout, hang, and kill the rebel forces and bring fire and sword to those who aid them. Well, as you can imagine, this declaration doesn't exactly go over well with the local woodsmen, and it only gathers more patriots to their cause. Soon, the militia garners a force of 1,000 men who are itching to take a fight to British over their brash threats. Decades on the frontier, spent horseback riding, hunting, and just surviving the harsh elements, had duly prepared these men to go up against the most effective and efficient fighting force in the world at that time. 350 North Carolina militiamen and another 400 South Carolina militiamen joined their cause.
And so Ferguson's threat, if you want to call it, or ultimatum, is stay out of the war, or else he's going to come over the mountains, hang your leaders, lay your country waste with fire and swords. Does that sound good?
Mm-hmm.
And so that generates all the motions and the movement and the communications that begin with not just people in the Overmountain regions. Overmountain men are only a portion of the men that fight here, maybe half. The rest of them come from the Piedmont of North and South Carolina and a spattering from Georgia. So the western part of the Carolinas are very well represented in the force that fights at the Battle of Kings Mountain. So when that command begins moving, it's in response to Ferguson's threat or potential threat to the Overmountain communities. And there must be a real belief there, because if you look at a route of their march, as they're coming across the mountains, they break into 2 commands and follow 2 different roads, because they do not want to take a chance on the Loyalists getting behind them and getting back into their settlement areas on the other side of the mountains. So the command that fights here is marching this way. They muster with more men from the Piedmont area of North Carolina and at Quaker Meadows, which is the home of Charles McDowell in modern-day Morganton. From there, their target is now Patrick Ferguson at Gilbertown, which is the seat of the new Rutherford County, which was created in 1779. So before they get to Gilbertown, I keep saying Biggerstown, but before they get to Gilbertown, they learn that Patrick Ferguson has probably withdrawn. It turns out he has. When they get there, he's gone. They overnight, they continue moving south because they believe he's going to 96. They're being led to believe that he's going down toward 96, way down into South Carolina. So it's at Alexander's Ford on the 5th of October during the night that a man rides into the camp very late at night who has learned the first probably solid bit of information that they get in so far 12 days of marching from the first unit that musters. And they learn that Ferguson is not going to 96, he's moving east. That is a key moment. This guy takes it on himself. He knows the command must know this, and he rides about 8 o'clock at night into an area that he's unfamiliar with. He's unfamiliar with the commanders. He knows them by reputation, but not in person, not meeting them. And he has a guide that he doesn't trust. And several times they get lost, and he believes the guide, and he's leading him into a trap. And some of the sources you'll read will say he's got a gun cocked to the guide's head. How true is that? I don't know. But he does get information to the command that Ferguson is moving this way now to the east.
Ferguson, realizing the growing threat, must find an encampment for his men and ready them to defend it. The obvious choice is Kings Mountain. Ferguson takes refuge atop the hill, an easily defensible high ground that should afford him the tactical advantage to ward off the over-mountain men and their added militias.
But as they march toward the Cowpens, they are joined by more men from what is today's Gaston County, North Carolina. It's the Lincoln County Militia Company that fights under a guy named William Graham. Graham is actually called away before the battle, but this command arrives as some of the men in the column know where Ferguson is camped on this ridge line. So things are starting to fall into place now. They got good information that night before or early that morning, and that day, now during the march, men come into the column that know exactly where he is. So some of these guys now are on their 13th day of traveling. So pretty impressive by any standard, definitely by today's standard. So when they arrive at the Cowpens on the 6th of October, they know Ferguson is up the road just a ways, maybe 30 miles, 35 miles. And this is much closer than they've ever been to him, and they have a solid point on a map, if they had a map, that they can point to. They know where the target is. So they take a break at the Cowpens, 3 or 4 hours, something like that, and begin marching this way. About 9 o'clock at night, their plan has been to break into 2 columns, and that first column rides out again about 9 o'clock at night in a pouring rain. The rain picks up as the night goes on, and they say it rains all night long. So the column marches from 9 o'clock at night at the Cowpens till the next morning when they cross the Broad River. And the rain begins tapering off in the morning. And keep in mind, these guys are traveling without benefit of night vision goggles, mag lights, and anything else to help them travel. And they're traveling on trails, unpaved, whatever you call improved roads. But they come up on the cabin, and there's a young guy in the Lincoln County Company named Enoch Gilmer. And Enoch Gilmer, I think, is about 14 or 15 years old, and he's considered a very, like an artsy guy. Like he could be in a play and he could cry and laugh in the same breath, and you'd feel that both emotions are genuine. That's pretty good, I guess. But he apparently is on the other side of the Broad River when the column comes up to the river at Cherokee Ford. And the idea is that to be cautious of an ambush, they're going to send somebody across to look around. And when the coast is clear, he's going to be singing a popular tune of the day that people would recognize. And when the column approaches the Broad River, they can hear this tune across the river. They know the coast is clear. Cross the river, take a break. Well, they ride on up a short distance, and they come to a cabin. Enoch Gilmer has gone ahead, and he goes up to the door of the cabin. He's a King's man. I need to know where Patrick Ferguson is. I got to join his army. And so the woman of the cabin invites him in, I guess, something like this. You see slightly different versions of it. And when they feel like he's the real deal, it's, oh yeah, my daughter just delivered chickens to Ferguson's camp 3 miles up the road. So things are starting to fall into place now from the morning before, when they knew almost nothing.
But on October 7th, Patriot forces arrive and begin their assault on Kings Mountain. Colonel Isaac Shelby, Benjamin Sharp, and John Sevier, among many other notable and highly respected militia leaders, begin moving their men through the trees, over rocks, and steep grades to reach the Tory invaders. Many of these men knew the area pretty decently well, and had even used the summit of the mountain as a rest area, kind of a lodging area during the hunting season. So they knew these grounds pretty decently. Fortunately, the night before had seen rain, which allowed the footsteps of the early mountain men to be soaked up under the wet leaves and brush, letting them sneak up on their defenders. Shelby instructed his men. He said, "Don't wait for the word of command. Let each one of you be his own officer, taking every care you can of yourselves. If in the woods, shelter yourselves and give them Indian play. Advance from tree to tree, pressing the enemy, killing and disabling all you can. At about 3 p.m., the first shots ring out from the American militiamen. As the men rise up and musket balls fill the air, the cry of Beaufort rings out through the woods. North Carolina Patriot leader Benjamin Cleveland tells his men, "Fire as quick as you can and stand your ground as long as you can. But when you can do no better, get behind trees or retreat. But I beg you not to run quite off. If we are repulsed, let us make a point of returning and renewing the fight," which they did. You see, Ferguson commanded 3 separate bayonet charges down the mountain, only to have the militias retreat, seemingly disappear into the woods, and return with a vengeance, pressing Loyalist forces back up the hill and closer to surrender. British and Loyalist forces began to find themselves being pushed further atop the mountain, and Patriots are starting to press in from every angle. Ferguson rallies his men to stay in formation, riding from one crest of the mountain to the other, and as the chaos begins to envelop, some of the Loyalists begin stripping white linen from their clothes and hoisting them up on the ends of their bayonets in surrender. Ferguson, having never given an order for surrender, rides by, striking the linens down with his sword and ordering his men to fight back against the incessant rebel forces. South Carolina Loyalist Alexander Chesney remarked at this situation, "Kings Mountain would have enabled us to oppose a superior force with advantage had it not been covered with wood, which sheltered the Americans and enabled them to fight in their favorite manner." Several accounts recall that as a wind broke through the fog of war, one of Ferguson's 2 mistresses, Virginia Paul, descended the mountain on a horse. As the men let her pass unassailed, she informed one of them that Ferguson could be identified, quite easily actually, by his red checkered hunting shirt. A youthful 16-year-old patriot from South Carolina by the name of Thomas Young retells his account of the fighting on the hill. "We fought our way from tree to tree up the summit. I recollect I stood behind one tree and fired until the bark was nearly all knocked off and my eyes pretty well filled with it. One fellow shaved me pretty close, for his bullet took a piece out of my gun stock. Before I was aware of it, I found myself apparently between my own regiment and the enemy, as I judged by seeing the paper the Whigs wore in their hats and the pine twigs the Tory in theirs." That's how they told each other apart. Panic spreads through Ferguson's ranks as the men realize their loss of ground has caused them to now take fire from the front as well as the back as militia forces press up the hill on every side. The Overmountain men crest the hill and begin pushing the Loyalists to the opposite side of the eminence, and there it seems that multiple men simultaneously see their prize. A British officer on horseback, sword in hand, blowing a silver whistle and wearing a checkered shirt. All at once, muskets ring out across the landscape as 7 to 9 musket balls lodge into Ferguson's chest, arms, and head, lifting him out of the saddle and landing him firmly on the ground. His horse, panicked at the loss of his rider, rides off, dragging Ferguson with his foot still caught in the stirrup. Now, there are conflicting reports detail the next occurrences. Some say that the Loyalist militiamen were able to grab him and set him up against a tree to draw his last breath, and other reports claim that the horse dragged the major into the Patriot lines, leaving him to rest there. As Militia Colonel Williams approaches the body of Ferguson in one last act of defiance, Ferguson draws a flintlock pistol, landing a shot to Williams in the gut, killing him. Williams' men see this and unload their rounds into the dying officer. Major Patrick Ferguson is dead.
So the battle does not wind down immediately because passions are up. People are fighting, and it's life or death. And some of these guys are firing on a white flag. Other guys are standing there next to a white flag and firing. Fog of war, you might say. But within a short time, the white flag gets hoisted very high, and it stays up, and the fighting begins dying down.
As the remaining Loyalist forces begin to surrender, many of the Overmountain men, spurred on by the previous atrocities exacted by the British, begin chanting, "Give them Beaufort's play! Give them Beaufort's play!" cutting down many Loyalist fighters before their leadership could stop the advance. The battle is over in less than an hour. Ferguson lies dead alongside 150 other Loyalist and British soldiers. The Overmountain men have dealt a serious psychological blow to Cornwallis in the Southern campaign. This victory routed the nearly constant British victories they had seen over the summer, and with the British greatest resource for garnering Loyalist support now vanquished, it would pose an uphill battle to using American Loyalist forces to help fight for the crown. The utility of Tory sympathizers in the colonies could not be overstated for the British, and the death of Ferguson quickly stifled enthusiasm for allegiance to the king. Just days after the victory, a makeshift court-martial is held by the rowdier bunch of patriots in Shelby's camp. And once the proceedings are called to order, 36 Tories are sentenced to death. Would to God every tree in the wilderness bore fruits such as that, one man noted, as 9 British were hanged before Colonel Shelby could arrive and put a stop to the killings. 3 weeks later, news arrived in Virginia of the victory at Kings Mountain. Suddenly, enthusiasm for the Patriot cause began to rekindle again, and after hearing of the misdeeds of Tarleton, more and more colonists were essentially willing to side with the Patriot cause. British Commander Clinton gave his account of the times, and this is pretty satisfying. He says, "The instant I heard of Major Ferguson's defeat, I foresaw most of the consequences to result from it. The check so encouraged the spirit of rebelling in the Carolinas that it could never be humbled. It was the first leak in a chain of evils that followed each other in regular succession until it ended the total loss of America." From the American side, Thomas Jefferson gave his thoughts. He says the memorable victory was the joyful annunciation of that turn in the tide of success which terminated the Revolutionary War with the seal of independence. The British invasion of the colonies would never recover from this turn of the tides. Patriot sentiment began ramping up and put a harsh period on the summer where the fighting would end, as many British generals would soon be lodging in for the winter. The next pivotal battle would capitalize on the success of the Over-Mountain Men in a small area just south known as the Cowpens. Now today you can visit Kings Mountain just on the northern border of South Carolina. While many of the shots you have seen here show brush and trees, the forest of 1780 were far grander with larger trees to hide behind and less underbrush. It truly is amazing to walk on ground where my fellow countrymen fought and died so that I can enjoy the freedoms we all hold so dear today. There are plenty of monuments along the trails showing where certain officers were killed or wounded, and even the exact spot where it is believed that Major Patrick Ferguson was knocked from his horse. Inside, there's a plethora of materials for learning about the battle, and if you plan to go, the anniversary event will be held on October 7th, just a few days from the posting of this video. The park includes a well-paved 1.5-mile track with minimal to moderate elevation changes and offers a relaxing experience to learn of the significance of this battle. Even in 1930, President Hoover stood on this exact spot to give a speech recognizing the bravery of the Over-Mountain Men. As many as 75,000 onlookers filled these woods to hear the president speak. "This is a place of inspiring memories," Hoover stated. "Here, less than 1,000 men, inspired by the urge of freedom, defeated a superior force." This small band of patriots turned back a dangerous invasion well designed to separate and dismember the United Colonies. It was a small army and a little battle, but it was of mighty portent. History has done scant justice to its significance, which rightly should place it beside Lexington and Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Yorktown, as one of the crucial engagements in our long struggle for independence. If you'd like to learn more about the park, please click the link right here in the description below, and don't forget to visit the Cowpens battlefield just down the road while you're there. So I really hope that you enjoyed this installment, and we got one more thing to discuss before you click off this video real quick, and that is, what do we do with the knowledge of this story now that we have it? Is it just something nice to kind of muse about in our day? Well, yeah, it is, but there's so much more to that. And I don't know what stories like this do for you, but I know what they do for me. They do inspire me to be involved in politics. They inspire me to stay engaged, to stay up to date with what's going on. Of course, the National Association for Gun Rights offers the perfect way to do that. By becoming a member for $30, you're able to keep up to date with what's going on and what you can do about it. So, there has been a lot of blood that has been spilled exactly where I'm standing right now, and I don't take that lightly. There have been millions of Americans who have given up everything. There have been far too many men who didn't come home, far too many wives that don't have a husband, or brothers that don't have a brother, sisters that don't have a brother, sons that don't have a dad, just for the ability for us to not have to care. And I hope that stories like this bring back that caring, bring back that inspiration to stay involved with what's going on, because that price has already been paid. We don't have to assault a hill like this. We don't have to drop everything we're doing and fight for our freedom like they had to 250 years ago. That price has been paid, that blood has been spent. So all that you have to do is give a phone call to your legislator. organize a group in your own community, join a group in your own community that holds legislators accountable for their actions, or if you feel the need, run for office yourself. So, as I said, it definitely makes me feel like I have a need and an inspiration to be engaged, an obligation, because there's of the people that fought and died for this country, for the people that are fighting and dying now for this country. It is up to us to make sure that America is that country that's worth fighting and dying for. That is our responsibility. Not everyone has the call to join the military or do military service, but we all have a call to render some kind of service to our country. And I'm asking that you do that, starting off with an NAGR membership and just being active in your local community. But guys, thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. I truly hope that you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, leave a comment about how much you enjoyed it or what we could do better or what you want to hear about next. So anyways, guys, my name's Tommy Dimsdale with the National Association for Gun Rights. Y'all have a blessed